In addressing the burden of disease, the first thing we look at is the incident rate. Let's talk about how to calculate this. Let's start with the definition. Incident rate is a measure of the number of new cases of a disease or an injury in a population. And it's a useful starting point in establishing the cause of a disease, what we call the etiology. Now I have here, it's often expressed as what per 100,000 people in the denominator. As you could see from this slide, here's per 100,000 residents. That is a very common denominator when you're looking at large populations. If you're looking at smaller samples, you would use something like 10,000 or 1,000. The point being is that there is not one denominator for all samples. You need to look at the size of the sample to determine the correct denominator or the correct per X number of people. To calculate incidence rate, we take the number of new cases of a disease in a year and we divide by the number of people in the at-risk population. So what I mean by at-risk is I mean people that actually could get this disease. So for example, if you're looking at an incident rate of prostate cancer, you would not consider women in that bottom number because women don't have prostates and so they are not at risk of getting prostate cancer. So if you have somebody who is not at risk of getting the disease you're looking at, you would not include them in the bottom number. All right, time for an example. So let's say we're interested in the incidence rate of chickenpox among Costa Mesa K-12 school district for the year 2018. Now we're going to assume that no one has had the vaccination. Why do I say that? Because if they've had the vaccination, then they're not at risk anymore because they've been immunized. So let's do this example assuming no one has had the immunization. So we know from the school enrollment data that there were 15,000 students in the whole school district in 2018. Assume no one has had the chickenpox before. The health officials for the school district counted 3,472 cases of chickenpox in 2018. So, how do you calculate the incidence rate? Remember from the previous slide, you take the number of new cases and divide it by the number of people in the at-risk population. The number of new cases, 3,472. The number of students in the at-risk population in this example is 15,000. To calculate, we take 3,472, the new cases, divided by the at-risk, which is 15,000, and because this is a smaller population, I'm going to choose 1,000 as my base. So this divided by this times this equals 231.46 per 1,000 students. Another bit of information, since half a person doesn't exist, we're going to round up. So with incident rate, you always round up. So what we would say is for this year, the incidence of chickenpox in the Costa Mesa School District was 232 cases per 1,000 students. Now think about the measles epidemic. A lot of people have been immunized, so the number of people at risk is actually smaller than the whole population. So to say that there's been 200, 300 cases is actually a lot if you think about there are not that many people at risk of getting it. So this is where incidence rate is important. So we could have used another base, but I felt that 1,000 was appropriate because we don't have 100,000 students and 100 would be too little. So incidence rate. Make sure you understand how to calculate this because it will be on a quiz. Moving forward, let's look at mortality rate. Now mortality rates are the same as incidence rates except for you are looking at the number of deaths in a year. So you would take the number of deaths in a year and divide it by the number of people who are at risk, and that would be everybody who's alive in the population. So the incidence rate for disease or injury, you would say, is maybe 100 cases per 100,000 per year. If it's a mortality rate, which is death, you might say the incident rate is 95 deaths per 100,000 per year. You may even say the mortality rate is 95 deaths per 100,000 per year.